Good morning, everyone. It's almost 9, so we'll begin in a second, but I just got one little quick note. During the day, if you have questions that you think of that you want to ask the faculty for our later panel, feel free to either, kind of like last night with the judges' talk, either tweet them to directly to the Institute page or Instagram, or there's also a thread in the Mises U 2020 Facebook group. So one of those three things, just put them in there, and then when we get to the panel, I'll read them off from there. So I'll kind of help with the microphone logistics. So with that being said, Dr. Sean Ritenour.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock, and what better way to say good morning than with a lecture on Austrian capital theory. So here we are. Capital is defined by Mises in Human Action as the sum of the whole complex of goods destined for acquisition, evaluated in money terms. And there's actually quite a bit packed into that definition. One phrase that's important is this phrase, destined for acquisition. The whole complex of goods destined for acquisition. What does this mean? Well, it means those goods used for production and sale of products. The acquisition here is the acquisition of money income. And so there are certain goods that producers have that they're going to use to produce monetary income, to acquire monetary income, and the whole complex of those goods used to acquire money income that evaluated themselves in money terms is what he calls capital. So he also refers to capital as the sum, this sum of the whole complex of goods destined for acquisition, evaluated in money terms. This sum is the starting point of economic calculation. And so we see in them that capital, there's been a lot written on capital for a good reason. It's not necessarily easy to simply get your finger on it, to get your hands on it, your head wrapped around it. People are either prone to see it as only physical goods. Some people are prone only to see it as dollars or money. And Mises says it's a sum. It's a sum, it's an evaluation. It's a sum of evaluation of capital assets. And Mises reminds us that there, in another spot, page 500 of Human Action, if you're interested, he says, quote, "There is no such thing as an abstract or ideal, quote unquote, capital that exists apart from concrete capital goods. Capital is always embodied in definite capital goods and is affected by everything that happens with regard to them. The value of an amount of capital is a derivative of the value of the capital goods in which it is embodied." Right? So there is this capital as a tool of calculation is a dollar amount, a monetary amount, but it's the sum of the value of physical capital goods. And so we have to keep both of them in play. And I'm afraid probably what I will have time to do today in this lecture is focus mostly on the capital structure, right? To understand Austrian capital theory, it's helpful and it's necessary for us to understand the production structure and the capital structure, the structure of the intertemporal structure of the capital goods, but also we need to understand economic calculation, right? And how economic calculation then works to allow the entrepreneur to calculate and to, in some sense, appraise the value of these capital goods. Now, thankfully, right after this lecture, Dr. Salerno is going to be talking about economic calculation, so you're going to get both sides of the capital coin, so to speak. In this lecture, I probably am only going to have time mainly to talk about the production structure and how that all works towards an understanding of capital. The idea of Austrian capital theory then and the production structure is rooted in Karl Menger's exposition of the interrelationship of economic goods. And this is found in his Principles of Economics. And he distinguishes between two types of goods. One is consumer goods, and the other is higher order goods, or goods of the first order and higher order goods. Consumer goods, by definition, are those goods that are directly serviceable, right? Things that themselves directly satisfy us. In other words, when we obtain them, we use them, we don't need anything else besides them to give us satisfaction. So if I'm parched, right, it's relatively warm, and if I feel the need for liquid refreshment, I get a bottle of water, I drink it, and I am refreshed. I don't need to add anything to water, right? You don't have to add anything to it. You just drink it, and there it is. That's what makes a consumer good a consumer good. And Menger refers to these goods as goods of the first order, goods of the lowest order, and we'll see why in just a little bit. But then he contrasts these consumer goods, these goods of the first order, with higher order goods. Higher order goods we could also call producer goods. And these are goods that are indirectly serviceable. These are goods that are used eventually, ultimately, to produce consumer goods. We will be, there's all kinds of, any consumer good you can think of, there are goods used to produce those consumer goods. Right? If we want to get a bottle of water that we want to purchase, well, that requires the water, yes, but also the bottle. Right? Well, where does the bottle come from? The bottle has to be produced, and therefore it's a producer good. It is indirectly serviceable. It is serviceable. It helps us accomplish our end, but it is indirectly. Right? We don't eat the bottle. Right? We don't get any liquid refreshment from the bottle per se, but the bottle is helpful for us to eventually achieve refreshment because it holds the water that refreshes us. And so a higher order good is transformed into directly serviceable consumer goods only at some point in the future. Now, it is sort of customary to understand, or we can categorize these higher order goods into three broad categories. Land, which includes all of the natural resources in the land, right? So the terra firma and any minerals or water in the land. Then there's labor, right? Human exertion. And land and labor are often referred to as original factors, right? They're original factors. They're independently productive, right? If I want to do something, if I want to produce something, I need to exert labor. I don't have to manufacture my labor first. I don't have to, somehow say, oh, I'd like to make this ham sandwich, but first let me go back into into the pantry for about 15 seconds, or 15 minutes rather, while I manufacture the labor I'm going to use to make the ham sandwich. No, the labor's with me, right? And so I can just use that effort. Land, the same. Land is here before any of us was here. Land is here. It's the original factor in some sense, right? And those two goods, land and labor, are distinct from another set of producer goods that we call capital goods. These are produced means of production, right? If I want to make a house, right, the 2x4s, the shingles, those things are things that have to be produced that we use to make the house. Those are capital goods. The hammer, right, the nail gun, those would all be considered rightly producer goods, or capital goods, produced means of production. Right? And so that is sort of the taxonomy of goods that Menger lays out. And that is in some sense, the starting point for us to understand the structure of production, then that is very helpful for us to understand the nature of capital. So let's talk a little bit more about this structure, and we are going to begin by recognizing that each consumer good is made possible because of its structure of production. And we're going to, by way of only the best for the students at Mises University. So we're going to begin by discussing the best quintessential dessert in the history of Western civilization, which means, of course, in the history of the world. Right? And that is the flourless chocolate cake, right? The flourless chocolate cake. It is something that everybody should have, everybody should eat. I was going to say everybody should taste, but you don't really taste a flourless chocolate cake, you experience it, right? It is an experience in gastronomical bliss. And words cannot express how tremendous this is. To make a good such as such a flourless chocolate cake, it's actually relatively simple. What is needed to make a flourless chocolate cake? Well, it requires some higher order goods, such as chocolate, of course. I mean, it's a flourless chocolate cake, right? You need essentially a pound of semi-sweet chocolate. You need a half a pound of butter. You need 8 eggs. I told you it was good. I'm not kidding. You need a mixer. You need a spring-form pan. You need an oven. There are other things that you need, which I don't have on this picture, but you need these things, right? And so before we eat the flourless chocolate cake, before we can consume the consumer good of the flourless chocolate cake, we need the chocolate, the butter, the eggs, the spring-form pan, the mixer, the oven, etc., etc. Now, how do we obtain these things? The producer obtains services of the factors of production by purchasing them in exchange for money. When the production of the low-order good is completed, the producer sells it for money. So when the producer of the flourless chocolate cake, let's suppose we are in business and we own a business called Desserts R Us. And we make only desserts, and our sort of dessert of name is the flourless chocolate cake. Right? To make that, then, we see here a whole host of goods that are necessary. Of course, land and labor, yes. A semi-sweet chocolate, which I mentioned, butter, eggs. We need electricity, right, to run the mixer, to run the oven, perhaps. We need an oven. It's helpful to have also a microwavable oven, because you're going to have to melt the butter and the semi-sweet chocolate together, and it's easiest to do that if you don't want to go the whole double burner route, which is kind of a pain. You need a mixer, a stand-up mixer. Well, you don't have to have a stand-up mixer, but it helps. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You need a bowl, right? You need at least one bowl. You need a spring-form pan. A spatula is very helpful because you don't want to waste any of it in the bowl. You want to get it all into the spring-form pan, right? So you need all of these goods, right? Well, then, okay, that's fine. But then you could ask yourself, well, where does the semi-sweet chocolate come from? In order to get semi-sweet chocolate, it doesn't literally grow on trees, right? I mean, yes, okay, you need some cocoa solids, which, you know, are derived eventually from, you know, the cocoa beans. But they don't. But the semi-sweet chocolate, you can't go anywhere and well, maybe I haven't discovered. If you can tell me where to find, you know, trees that grow semi-sweet chocolate, please tell me. I'd be very happy about this. But no, the semi-sweet chocolate has to be produced from cocoa solids, cocoa butter, sugar. It's produced in a factory, right? We need transporting the finished product to the places where people can buy them, right? Of course, and they need land and labor to make these things. What about butter? Butter requires raw milk, salt, a separator, tanks in which the butter is churned, a churner itself. We need packaging, we need a dairy plant, we need transport, land, and labor. What about eggs? Where do eggs come from, right? Well, they come from chickens, of course, but then to produce eggs, we need chickens, we need chicken feed, we need a chicken coop of some sort, places like a chicken apartment, if you will. Maybe it's condos if the chickens can own their own places. Water, we need certain automated equipment if we want to produce eggs most efficiently. We need packaging, electricity. We need a poultry plant or an egg plant, an egg factory, not the gourd-looking thing, eggplant, not that kind of eggplant. We need transport, we need land and labor. Electricity, we need power plants, et cetera, right? So you can look at this stage just above all of these goods that are going to be used in the manufacturing of the flourless chocolate cake, and they all need to be produced, right? I mean, where are we going to get the oven, the microwave oven, the spring-form pan, the mixer? Well, we go to a kitchen supply shop, and the kitchen supply shop, of course, they need buildings, they need fixtures, that they have to accumulate wholesale all of these goods that are used to make the flourless chocolate cake. And then, of course, if you go far enough up the structure, if you consider the mixer requires zinc castings, metal parts, paint, tools, electronic parts. It needs the factory in which the mixer is made, land and labor, of course. And then you go far enough up, of course, it requires a certain amount of mining and farming and refining and production of various other higher order goods that we can't even go into because we only have so much space on one screen. And quite frankly, it begins to boggle the mind. Right? And so at every step of the way, when a consumer good is sold, the producer of that consumer good gets income. Also, however, previous to that, the producer of that consumer good has already purchased higher order goods from higher order producers. Right? And so the capital good, the semi-sweet chocolate, the butter, the eggs, the electricity, the oven, etc., has been purchased by the producer first. And then those goods are used for the production of a lower order good, in this case the consumer good, which is also sold for money. And this process starts at the very top, right? The miners invest in mining zinc, and then the zinc is used to make a zinc casting, which is then used to make a standing mixer, which is then sold to the baker, which is then used to make the flourless chocolate cake, which is consumed by a very, very happy person. And this process then continues from the higher stages to the lower stages. And that by itself then tells us about a very important principle related to the production structure. And that is that production effort moves down the structure of production. Effort moves down the structure of production. What that means is that we don't start by making the flourless chocolate cake and then we make the semi-sweet chocolate to make the flourless chocolate cake. No, to make the flourless chocolate cake, we first have to make the semi-sweet chocolate. Before we can make the semi-sweet chocolate, we first have to make the cocoa solids. To make the cocoa solids, we first have to harvest the cocoa beans. Right? And so the production effort has to start at the top of the production structure and then moves down. On the other hand, value and income directionally move up the structure of production. Right? The reason why there is, say, that butter is valued is partly due to the fact that butter is used in making flourless chocolate cake, as well as other things. Right? If the reason semi-sweet chocolate is valued is that semi-sweet chocolate is used to make flourless chocolate cake and other things. Right? Semi-sweet chocolate, of course, is also can be used as a consumer good, but that's a topic we're going to talk about just briefly down the road. The point is that the chocolate, butter, eggs mixture are all valued because they can be used in making the flourless chocolate cake that is valued. Right? Cream is valued because it can be used to make butter that is valued. Right? Chickens are valued because they can be used to make eggs that are valued, and the eggs are valued because they can be used to make flourless chocolate cake. Right? And so we have this principle of derived demand. Right? The higher order good, the demand for the higher order good is derived from the demand for the lower order good. So value is imputed up the structure of production. Now, in a monetary economy, of course, that means that money income also moves directionally up the structure of production, right? The consumer buys a flourless chocolate cake from Desserts R Us. Desserts R Us invest in higher order goods. They spend money buying a mixer, buying semi-sweet chocolate, buying butter, etc., and the money that they spend on butter and eggs, etc., is income received by the maker of butter, the maker of semi-sweet chocolate. Right? When the butter manufacturer buys the cream, they spend money investing in the cream. That is income that's received by the dairy producer. And so value is imputed up the structure of production. Monetary income moves up the structure of production directionally. Right? We're not saying that when we say income moves up the structure of production, we're not saying that income is the most, it's the highest, the largest magnitude at the highest stage. We're just simply saying we're talking about directions of movement here. Now those producers who use their money to invest in the purchase of factors of production are referred to as capitalists. Right? Those producers that invest that savings in the accumulation of factors of production that they will then use to produce a good that will be sold sometime in the future, they're called the capitalists. And so the capitalists are the ones that produce and own various stages of capital goods throughout the structure of production. Now, we know that any act of production takes time, and hence, because production is an action. All action takes time. Engaging in production takes time. Making a flourless chocolate cake takes at least, I would say, an hour. And quite frankly, it takes more than that, because really to get the primo flourless chocolate cake, you want to make it the night before and let it set in the refrigerator and let the flavor sort of mellow and get really, really good, right? And so there is a time span there. And I mean, and you're not want to do that. You're going to see it come out, and you know you can't, dive into it right away because it's warm, it's hot, it's baked. But you don't even want to, if you want to just leave it sit for maybe a half an hour and then dive in, but don't do it. You want to, you will, there will be, what shall we say, a higher level of satisfaction if you wait, right? You wait that just make the production structure a tiny bit more roundabout and things will be better, trust me. In any event, production takes time. And hence and of course, so we invest and we produce now. We don't reap the reward, we don't reap the revenue until some point in time in the future. Well, what do we know about the future? The future is uncertain. Right? And so because all production takes time, it's based on a speculation about the future state of the market. The structure of production is the other side, in some sense, of the division of labor coin. The structure of production is the other side of the division of labor coin. All of these goods, the vast majority of these goods are produced by people that specialize in producing these things, right? And you think about different companies, right, that produce certain things like KitchenAid. What are KitchenAid known for? Well, the stand-up mixer. They produce mixers. They produce other things too, but they're really well known at producing mixers. A lot of companies specialize, Ghirardelli specialize in producing chocolate, right? There's a lot of these goods are produced by people who have specialized in producing just that thing. And so the structure of production, in some sense, is the other side of the division of labor coin. Just like the division of labor, the production structure must be coordinated by entrepreneurs. I mean, how do we know exactly how many eggs should be produced? How do we know how many cocoa solids should be produced, right? Well, that is handled through the coordination process of economic calculation by entrepreneurs that Dr. Salerno will be talking about shortly. So any investment in production is made in anticipation of a later sale to lower order producers and then finally to consumers. So the complex structure of production is only made possible by use of capital goods. A production structure like this obviously has loads of capital goods in it. And using capital goods requires longer production processes, meaning we have to invest in the production of the capital goods first before we can use them to make the consumer goods. And so if I want to have my dessert shop, Rittenou's Desserts or something, and I need to get myself a mixer, well, I can't just click my heels and say there's no place like mixing. There's no place like mixing and hope at Shazam, it's just right there. Right? No, I have to invest money. I have to spend $500 to get a stand-up mixer like this. Well, that means that I cannot spend that $500 on something else, which means I'm going to have to forego my ping pong table. Or not my ping pong table. It's a ping pong table I don't own because I haven't bought it yet because I spent the $500 on a mixer, right? In other words, I have to forego the opportunity to purchase a ping pong table that I'm going to use for fun because I'm spending the $500 on the mixer. So I can use the mixer to aid in future production of flourless chocolate cake only by sacrificing recreational consumption now in the form of no ping pong games. Now, this restriction of consumption we call saving. The restriction of consumption is called saving. And the transfer of the saved resources, the transfer of the $500 towards accumulating the capital goods, that's called investment. Right? So saving and investment go together. Right? In order for investment to occur, someone has to save. Investment requires saving by somebody. Now, why do we do this? Why would we forego the joy of ping pong just to get a mixer? Well, we get a mixer because it helps us produce what we want to produce. It aids in our productivity. And capital goods, that's what capital goods are good for. They increase our productivity. They increase the productivity of land and labor, and they do so in two ways. They increase productivity in two ways. First, they increase the production of goods we can produce without capital goods. That they help us produce more efficiently. Right? It is possible, for instance, if you want to make a flourless chocolate cake, you can use your fingers and not a mixer. Right? It is possible. I don't advise it, but you can do it, right? You can break your 8 eggs in your bowl and just start, moving your hands real fast, right? Now, at some point, and it won't take long, especially in today's era of texting and tweeting and snapping and gramming and whatever else we do, you're like this, carpal tunnel sets in very, very quickly. We don't want that, right? Who wants to just sort of go and then, of course, you have a handful of, slimy stuff, which is not altogether pleasant. So instead of doing that, we can use a mixer, right? You can use a mixer. And so the mixer increases our productivity. Now, what's great about the mixer, of course, especially the standing mixer, so you put the eggs in there, you put it in place, you hit the button at the right speed, it starts whirling around, and that frees you up to go and chop up the chocolate and the butter and put it in the microwave oven and start it melting while the mixer is going. So in some sense, it's like you're doubling your labor output almost through the beauty of capitalism, right? It's capitalism that makes this possible. So increasing the production of goods we can produce without a capital good is one way that capital goods increase our production. A second way is it allows people to produce goods that they otherwise could not obtain, at all. Here we have, some goods cannot be produced at all without the use of capital goods. Here we have actually a very rare photo of a primitive man. They used to have a fishing contest, it turns out, centuries, eons ago. And here we have the caption to this photo. Before the hook, the pole, and the worm were even thought of, there existed a time known to fish as the Golden Age. And why is it the Golden Age? Because these are poor people trying to grab fish by ramming their hands down in the water, and it's up to no avail, right? They're having a hard time catching fish. Why? Because they don't have a pole, a hook. They don't have a bow or an arrow. All they have is their hands, right? And so they can't really catch fish without any of these things. They need capital goods to produce fish at all, right? We need capital goods to have glasses. Glasses would not be able to be produced without capital goods. This screen, this projector, would not be at all possible without using tools and capital goods to produce them. And so the availability of capital goods, even more importantly, increases our productivity by allowing us to produce goods that would not be available at all without them. So having capital goods increases our productivity, and ultimately the main economic function is to advance people in time towards their objective in producing the consumer goods. Right? What the flourless chocolate cake, or what the mixer does for us, what the springform pan, what the chocolate and the eggs, etc., does for us, it makes it easier for us to get our flourless chocolate cake more quickly. It advances us in time towards our objective of obtaining the consumer good. Now, if that's the case, then what is it that keeps people from investing more and more resources in capital goods? If capital goods are so great because they increase our productivity, which they do, why aren't we just always accumulating more and more capital goods? What holds us back? Well, what holds us back is time preference. Right? The fact that at some point, people value present goods more than some amount of goods in the future. In fact, if we're talking about the same amount of goods, people prefer present goods more than the same amount of goods in the future, right? If you're on the Wheel of Fortune, or not Wheel of Fortune, what is it? The Price is Right. You know, they have the usually like spin the wheel. The Showcase Showdown. And they say, what's in the Showcase Showdown, Johnny? And he says, a brand new car. You know, he's really, they get so crazy and excited. They don't realize how much in gift tax they're going to have to pay if they win the car. But they're really excited. And imagine, say, well, a brand new car 5 years from now. Well, that's nice, right? But it sort of takes the edge off of it a little bit, doesn't it? It's like, well, okay, 5 years from now. Maybe I'll be here, maybe I don't, who knows? But that's a long, even if I am here, it's like 5 years from now. I got to struggle with what I have for 5 years. I mean, the point is that people prefer their ends satisfied sooner than later. And therefore, what that means is we have to consume something in the present to live. We're going to value some goods in the present. We always value goods in the present. And we value goods in the present more than we value the same goods in the future. We cannot just continue to put off consumption forever because we need to consume to live. And it's time preference that determines how willing people are to save and invest. Everybody has a subjective time preference. Everybody has not only do they have subjective preferences over do I want to eat apples or oranges today, but they also have a subjective preference, or do I want, do I want 5 apples today, or 5 apples tomorrow, or 5 apples a year from now? So time preference constrains people's willingness to perpetually save and invest. So those are principles that are important for us to understand about the nature of the production structure. Now, when people engage in accumulating capital goods to help them produce their output, there are a number of choices that they have to make regarding capital and capital goods. One of the choices is how capital intensive do we want the production process to be, right? We can arrange production in a more or less capital intensive process. There are different ways different things we can use to aid us in whipping and beating eggs, right? We can use a fork and a bowl, right? That's pretty easy and simple if you're just making a little omelet. But you can also use a whisk. It gets a little more action. You can use a handheld mixer. In fact, the recipe that I use, which I highly recommend, it's from Cook's Illustrated magazine. It's called the Ultimate Flourless Chocolate Cake, and I'm not kidding, it is the ultimate. They say, look, if you can't afford a KitchenAid, that's okay. Just use a stand-up mixer, use a handheld mixer, and you can just put it on books, right? You can put it on books, and then use that as sort of your makeshift standing mixer. And I suppose it works. Thankfully, I've invested. Actually, my parents were kind enough to invest for me years ago. I think when we got married, they bought us a mixer, a KitchenAid mixer, and we're on our second mixer. That's you know your marriage is a successful one if you're on your second mixer, because that's a durable good. And so so far we're a 2-mixer marriage, and that's good. But anyway, you can use a KitchenAid stand-up mixer, or if you really want to bring out, the big hosses, you've got this industrial mixer, which is huge. I mean, I don't know how, at least 30 to 50 KitchenAid stand-up mixer in terms of volume, right? And each of these are of different sort of capital intensives, different, they're differently capital intensive. What the producer uses depends on his preferences, depends on the choices that the producer makes. In other words, it's a choice variable, right? There's no one that says you have to use an industrial mixer, or you have to use a fork, or you have to use a hand mixer, a hand beater, right? The producer makes this choice, right, according to how well it fits in with his production plans. Another choice variable is the degree of specificity. Right? Different capital goods are of different degrees of specificity. I would argue that eggs are less specific than a spring-form pan because eggs have more uses. Right? A spring-form pan has particular uses, like for flourless chocolate cake, maybe a cheesecake. There's probably other uses that you could use it for that it's not really designed for. Eggs are more ubiquitous, right? You can use them for flourless chocolate cake, of course. You could use them for flour full cake. Interesting by side note is the flourless chocolate cake is the only dessert that we know of that is named for the ingredient it does not possess. It's a little fun fact there, a little kitchen trivia. But if you want to make a flour full cake, you also could use eggs. If you want to make chocolate chip cookies, eggs, right? If you want to make an omelet, eggs, right? If you want to be Rocky Balboa, you drink raw eggs. And that's what he did in the movie, and it worked out for him, right? He ended up beating Apollo Creed, and then a bunch of other people after that. Mr. T, I think, and this Russian guy. So anyway, there's a whole host of uses for eggs, and so eggs are less specific as a capital good than, say, a spring-form pan. Similar to chocolate, there's a difference between milk chocolate and special dark chocolate. The flourless chocolate cake doesn't call for just any old chocolate, it calls for special dark. It's specific for specific types of uses. Right? So the degree of capital specificity is a choice variable. Durability also needs to be taken into account. Right? All capital goods are perishable. No capital good lasts forever. And what we call depreciation is simply the rate at which capital goods are used up. And each particular capital good has a different rate at which it is used up. Right? An egg used to make a cake, for instance. An egg used to make a cake is used up almost instantaneously. I mean, you put it in the bowl, you can't get it back. Right? You can't sort of like whip up the flourless chocolate cake batter and say, oh, you know what? I forgot I didn't eat breakfast today. Let me extract 2 of the 8 eggs out of the flourless chocolate cake, and I'll use those for an omelet. Nay, nay. You can't do that, right? And so the egg has a very high rate of depreciation. The oven, on the other hand, may last for 15 years or more, right? The oven may last a long time. Our oven actually lasted more than that in our kitchen. And so that is a much slower rate of depreciation. Here we have the choice between sort of a flimsy spatula and these sort of really more hardy, long-lasting, sort of solid silicone spatulas and kitchen equipment. The little flimsy one on your left there is a 2-part deal. It has like this little flimsy top, which does a job, but then the plastic handle is sort of stuck in, it's like rammed in there, and it usually doesn't last very long. It gets loose, especially if you wash it and use it a lot, and it falls apart, and it's, that's why you can probably buy it at the dollar store, but then you get what you pay for. But the point is, that's the point, that is the very point, right? That different goods are more or less durable, and then that means that the producer gets to decide, do I want to invest in a capital good that's more durable given the price, or do I want to invest in a capital good that's going to be less durable but it's going to get me by right now with a lower price, right? Those are the decision variables. Now, we know that after any capital good is used or wears out, if it wears out, we're back to where we started. In other words, we can use a spatula for great effect, but if it wears out, then we have no spatula, we're back to our hands. Right? And so to maintain productivity, it's not enough to save and invest in a capital good once. To maintain productivity, we have to save enough to maintain our capital. We have to save enough so that we have savings on hand to fund purchasing new capital goods when the old ones wear out. And we call that maintaining capital, keeping the value of our capital assets constant across time. Now, if a person invests in capital, but then doesn't continue to save, so that as the capital good wears out, he does not have any savings to fund replacement and maintenance, we call that consuming capital, right? Because over time, your quantity of capital will shrink. Right? The quantity of capital goods will shrink, and so the value of capital that you own shrinks. Now, so if you want to consume capital, it is easy. Basically do nothing. Just consume. Right? Just use and consume, don't save, and pretty soon you won't have any capital at your disposal. But again, the choice of whether or not you accumulate capital, add to your stock of capital, or add to the magnitude of capital, or you maintain capital, or you consume capital, that choice depends on how much a person values present goods over future goods. And this decision depends on two things. It depends on the value of the good produced. How much does he value the good that we're producing? Is demand for flourless chocolate cake relatively high, so it makes sense to make flourless chocolate cake? And also, it depends on his rate of time preference. How intense is his preference of present money over future money? And as we said, the entire economic order consists of one integrated production structure. The entire economic order is not just the production structure for flourless chocolate cake. It is one integrated production structure that incorporates all consumer goods and all producer goods. And in some sense, this is what we would consider the macroeconomy, if we wanted to call it that. And it's one important thing that sets Austrian economics apart from modern macroeconomics. Here we have modern macroeconomics. We've got a couple of different iterations there. There's sort of the Keynesian version, that comes right out of Keynes's book. Y output is a sum of consumption spending, C plus I investment spending, plus G government spending, plus NX net exports. Right? Or we could have the neoclassical, Solo's neoclassical growth model, where you model the entire economy as one giant production function, as if there's one economic czar pulling the lever, determining how much we're investing and how much labor we're using and all kinds of good stuff. No doubt, if you look at those models require a lot of aggregation of homogeneous units, right? The I in Keynes is basically just investment spending, homogeneous investment spending. It doesn't matter. For GDP, according to Keynes, it doesn't matter what we're investing in. As long as we're spending, it's good. It is a little more nuanced than that, but not much. In the neoclassical model, right, K is a homogeneous blob of something called shmoo, right? Samuelson or Lucas, Samuelson I think or Lucas, one of the two, referred to it as shmoo, this homogeneous blob. And so we can treat every unit of capital as exactly the same. Well, I hope by now, if you look at that production structure for flourless chocolate cake, the differences in specificity, the differences in durability, make, like, all the capital goods are very heterogeneous. It's the opposite of homogeneity. Capital goods are heterogeneous, with different uses, different specificity, different durability. And they must be used in the right place, at the right time, in the right combination with other complementary factors to be productive. All of that is missed in Keynesian and other modern macroeconomic theories, models. The economic order, the general economic order, is actually is an integrated aggregate production structure that supports the production of all consumer goods. And this has been represented by concentric circles by Eugen von Bombaverk in The Positive Theory of Capital, which sort of set the ball rolling along these ways. Bombaverk then building on Menger's taxonomy of goods. And then his principles were taken and expressed in the form of the Hayekian triangle by, not surprisingly, Hayek. It'd be funny to call it the Hayekian triangle if Hayek didn't use it. Hayek used to use, it was not called the Hayekian parallelogram, but we won't get into that. But the Hayekian triangle then was also then used by Rothbard and Roger Garrison and Jesus Huerta de Soto. The point is that capital is neither best represented as a stock of things or even as a flow of money, but as a structure in which all parts are interrelated through the production decisions made at every stage. And the same principles that apply to the individual process of producing flourless chocolate cake apply to the production of all processes in the macroeconomic economy. Throughout the entire economic order, and this is a diagram from Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. Throughout the entire economic order, money moves from the consumer goods industries up through the higher stages of production. And at the same time, production effort in the form of goods flows from the highest stages, mining and exploration, down to refining, down to production and manufacturing of capital goods, down to wholesaling, down to retailing. And finally, the supply and the sale of consumer goods. Now, there are three important points and facts we want to, that are brought out by the capital structure that we want to, I think, end with. And that is this. First, the production and the market division of labor is heavily weighted towards the production of capital goods. The amount of money spent on capital goods is much higher than that spent on consumer goods at any given point. The entire structure of production is supported then by saving and investment, not consumption. Right? In order to obtain all of these higher order goods that are used to produce consumer goods, there's a lot more money that has to be spent on those higher order goods at any given moment. Right? And so we do not sustainably stimulate, shall we say, the economy. We don't sustainably grow the economy by stimulating consumption. The economy is driven by saving and investment. Secondly, the capitalist is the laborer's benefactor by advancing income in the present to workers and sustains them through time-consuming production processes. Just watched this film, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. Have you ever seen the Ghost Protocol? And in one part, it's a very frightening part. I mean, it's all computer generated, but it's still very frightening. Ethan Hunt is outside this gigantic, the tallest building in the world, the Burj Dubai, the Burj Khalifa. That is a 160-story skyscraper in Dubai. And the people there tell us that at any given moment, there was 12,000 people working on this thing at any given day. Excavation began January 6, 2004. It officially opened, however, January 4th, 2010. So 6 years it took to build this thing. Right? And you have 12,000 people, say, starting on it. And as opposed to say, well, come in and start working and we'll pay you your salary 6 years from now when we start renting apartments. Well, I mean, try no money for 6 years? Right? Good luck with that. Right? These people needed income to sustain themselves and their families for the whole time during the production process. How's that going to happen? Well, it's the capitalist. The capitalist who saved and advanced money and gave them wages for the length of the production process before they saw a dime of revenue. Right? so the capitalist is the labor's benefactor. The capitalist is not the enemy. Right? The capitalist and the laborer work together. Dare I say it, they're comrades in arms, fighting scarcity. Right? Finally, the economic order is extremely complex. It is beyond the capability to design and to plan the production structure for a single good. And I actually think this is a very helpful a task for any social scientist, be they an economist, a sociologist, or whatever, a political scientist. If you ever attempted, you ever think for like half a second, well, maybe we could design an economy. Maybe we could just centrally plan. Wouldn't it be better? Eliminate the waste. Eliminate the anarchy. Sit down and trace out the production structure, the whole production structure of even just one consumer good. And ask yourself, well, how easy would it be to plan for just the production of one consumer good efficiently? And then, if that doesn't convince you, say, okay, now let's suppose we have to do it for all the consumer goods that we have available now. And the question, in some sense, the problem answers itself. It's beyond our capability. It's beyond the capability of any one person to do that. It's estimated that there are several million types of consumer goods produced in the U.S. economy alone. It's far beyond the capability of the human mind to comprehend, let alone design. Well, how does it happen? Well, it happens, as you're going to hear shortly, through economic calculation. It's the market prices of the consumer goods, but most importantly, the producer goods, the capital goods, that entrepreneurs are able to use to appraise the value of the capital assets that will then allow them to assess what is the state of my company, my firm. Is my capital, the value of my capital expanding, or is it shrinking based on what I have done and what I plan to do? And so economic calculation is crucial in our understanding of the value of capital. And that's what you're going to hear about next.
Who are you waving to? What? Oh, so she's waving. We need somebody in the front row. Why is everybody? Okay, good morning, everyone. My topic for this morning's lecture is calculation and socialism. And to start off with, I want to at least point to the article that's probably one of the most important articles written in the 20th century. And that was the article by Ludwig von Mises, Economic Calculation in a Socialist Commonwealth. Okay, so it basically destroyed the intellectual foundations for socialism. And I'll get into the background in a moment. But it not only did that, it was also sort of a revolutionary breakthrough in understanding the nature and function of the price system. It is in the form of a little booklet with an epilogue by a notable modern Austrian economist. So I highly recommend that you purchase it in the bookstore. So socialism started off in the 19th century. And the initial group of socialists, the ones who got the most notoriety, were known as utopian socialists. And some of them were French, and one was British. Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. Now, they had a certain way of approaching the publicity or the publicizing of socialism, right? And we'll get to that. But there was another group later on who reacted against the utopian socialists, in fact, gave them their name. And that was Karl Marx and his ally and friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, okay? And they called themselves the scientific socialists. So they were the ones who bestowed the name of utopian which was really negative and derogatory, on the earlier socialists. Because the earlier socialists, as we'll see, were sort of embarrassing to the socialist cause. We'll take Charles Fourier, the French utopian socialist, okay? Clearly something's wrong here. I mean, if you take a look at him. Fourier came up with an idea for how human beings and human life and economic activity should be should be organized, and they call it the phalanx stare, or the phalanx in English, which is the Roman phalanx of 144 soldiers in a certain formation. So right away, you can see he's sort of a socialist. He wants to mold human beings according to a certain vision, this vision that he has of ancient Rome and sort of a military formation. And as we go along, you'll see also that all of these socialists believe that they have they have access to a secret intuition, that none of us, a secret source of knowledge that none of us have access to or possess. They're the ones who are going to give us the truth and establish how human beings should interact in economic activity and in social activity. So in Fourier's vision, there would be garden cities. They'd be modeled after a kind of a grand hotel, and there'd be 1,500 to 1,600 people in this hotel. Again, according to sort of a Greek and Roman military formation. Each resident will be able to purchase accommodations according to their income. All residents would be a stockholder in the city. There'll be collective production. Everything would be produced collectively. There'd be no exchange, okay? All would share meals in a communal kitchen. So, you know, why is this the right way to organize human beings? Well, I mean, he never really tells us, okay? In fact, he goes on and his vision gets crazier. And the dirty work will all be shared. But the key here is that there's really one controlling mind, all right? And there's no exchange. There's no people acting according to their own value scales. And this is, he actually drew a picture of it. This is what it would look like, okay? So all human communities would be organized in this way, and people would live in these type of structures. He also built a model of it, all right? And here is one phalanx stair, which is near my home in New Jersey, in Monmouth, New Jersey. It's now abandoned and spooky, and, you know, it's ugly, okay? Doesn't look like it's fit for human habitation. But let's go on. Here are some of his ramblings. He told us that 19th century France was allegedly in the 5th stage of advancement. Okay, so they passed through different stages: confusion, savagery, patriarchism. The 4th stage was barbarity. So they were in the 5th stage, according to him, France was, in the mid-18th century, 19th century. And after passing through 2 more stages, it would approach the upward slope of harmony, which is the final stage of utter bliss. So all socialists have this idea that we're moving towards a stage of utter happiness and bliss in which everything will be perfect, in which we'd have a heaven on earth. And that would last for 8,000 years. I mean, how do you know that? How do you know it would last for 8,000 years and not 6,000 or 10,000, okay? But that doesn't matter, because eventually history would reverse itself after that 8,000 years, and society would regress back to the beginning, okay? Again, there's this secret, what we call gnosis, or secret source of information that no one else is really privy to, only the socialist planner or the socialist visionary. There were some other things that he said, they're just too funny to pass up. So he, in this stage, there'd be 6 new moons would replace the one in existence. A halo, okay, would appear around the North Pole, above it. The seas would turn to Kool-Aid. I don't think he used the word, you know, some kind of word for kind of fruit juice, Kool-Aid, we'll say. All violent and repulsive beasts would be replaced by their opposites. So you'd have an anti-lion, and you'd have an anti-chicken. The anti-chickens would roast themselves and immediately pop into your mouth when you're hungry. Okay, anticipate that you're hungry. You could ride the lions and so on. The human lifespan in the harmonic stage would stretch to 144 years. Okay, and 5/5 of everyone's time would be devoted to free love. This is another thing that almost all socialists, or in all socialist visions, okay. Okay, and back in the 19th century, they all, for the most part, were males. So, you know, this whole idea of free love. Okay, so now, the classical economists, even though economic theory hadn't been perfected by then, they still knew about supply and demand, and they crushed these plans that were put forth by these utopian socialists. And this is what was embarrassing to Marx and Engels later on, and we'll talk about. But for example, the basic question was, the incentives. I mean, if everybody gets this, is given income and goods and so on according to their needs, okay? If there's no exchange and everyone pretty much gets the same thing, or everyone gets things according to how productive the planner judges that they are, then who'll take out the garbage under socialism? This was the question the classical economists posed. Who's going to take out the garbage under socialism? Who'll do the dirty work? Who'll go down in the coal mines and do the unhealthy work and the dangerous work? Okay, who'll get up early in the morning and literally take out the garbage? Okay, this was solved under capitalism, as the classical economists realized, by supply and demand. Okay. By differentials in wage rates. The dirtier jobs, all other things equal, tended to get paid higher, okay? But the socialists answer, well, there'll be a new socialist man and new socialist woman, okay? They were, in fact, feminists, okay, even in the 19th century. And they would work for the honor, for being honored by the community for their contribution to the welfare of the community, all right? Now, on economic grounds, the classical economists won the debate, hands down. They embarrassed the socialists. But both groups, both the classical economists and the socialists, did take for granted that socialism could be as productive as capitalism, if not for the incentive problem, okay? Now that's sort of what was in the background there. And as we'll see, that's what Mises addressed. Right? The classical economists did see the incentive problem, but that's sort of a practical problem. And the socialists always said, there's different ways of solving it. We could give, instead of coins, we could give these special metals instead of money, and that'll be an incentive to work for the community, and so on. All right? So it was lurking there in the background. Marx had a brilliant polemical ploy, okay? Basically, he said, anyone who talked about socialism was stupid and unscientific and should shut up. And they were just utopians. So he was the one who coined that term. And he said, look, socialism is going to come with the inevitability of the laws of nature, or the inexorable laws of nature will bring socialism about, okay? Socialism will replace capitalism, just as capitalism replaced feudalism, just as feudalism replaced the slave societies of Greece and Rome. It's an ever upward movement towards the final stage of communism, okay, which some people claim that was sort of another stage with Marx. We had to pass through socialism before we got to communism, okay. So he said, this is a scientific doctrine, to understand that inevitably communism will come, and it will be the final stage. And that, therefore, if that is the case, it's like arguing about, whether it's going to snow tomorrow or not, okay? If it snows, it snows. I mean, it's a part, it's dictated by the laws of nature. You can't argue about the laws of nature. So everyone should just shut up, okay? He didn't want anybody talking. Anybody who tried to discuss what socialism may look like was considered unscientific and utopian and crazy like Fourier. Okay. And he said that, in fact, there's nothing we can do to speed it up. Okay, just as there's nothing that we can do to make rain come sooner. Okay, if there's a drought, well, the laws of nature will dictate when that drought comes to an end. Same thing is true of socialism. So Mises always pointed out that Karl Marx always focused on capitalism and the contradictions of capitalism. I mean, he never really wrote about socialism, what it would look like, okay? And that was deliberate. So he called his work, his magnum opus, Das Kapital, capital, okay? Not socialism. He didn't talk about that at all. So that was kind of brilliant. And everybody, trying to escape this label of being unscientific, kind of became Marxists, okay? Now, they didn't all agree with everything that Marx was saying about capitalism, but they stopped talking about, you see people stop talking about what socialism would look like in the future. So that's where Mises comes in. Now, Mises claimed that apart from the incentive problem, there was another, deeper, more profound problem with socialism. And that was that without a price system, socialism was impossible. So he stated his thesis as follows. Okay? He focused on a developed industrial economy with very complicated processes of production and many varied capital goods. And he said that a rational allocation of resources, that is, using the resources in their most highly valued uses to consumers, or even for the planners themselves, requires market prices. Right? But because socialism abolishes property, okay, and you have only one collective or one central planning board owning all of the property or determining how it is to be used, all the property, productive property, you could still own your own home, or not even your own home, really, the clothes on your back, your food, and so on. You could own those types of things. Well, you couldn't own any of the productive factors, okay? That is a definition of socialism, the abolition of, if you look at all socialist plans, all of them want to get rid of property. So it's the abolition of private property in the means of production, okay? In land, resources, capital goods, and any other material means of production, okay? The laborer was permitted to own his own labor and even get paid wages. So Mises's argument was brilliant in its simplicity, okay? He says, number one, socialism abolishes private property in capital goods and natural resources. Since a socialist state is the owner of all of these material factors of production, these non-human factors of production, they can't be exchanged any longer, okay? Without exchange, there could be no market prices. So if there's no exchange, if there's this one agency that owns everything, even if, for example, everybody's involved in making the decision, even if somehow you have a democratic decision-making, okay, about how to use the factors of production, the fact that they're not being exchanged and not being used according to the expectations and values of different minds means that you can really never generate any prices. So under socialism, because there's no market and no prices, the state cannot calculate the costs of production. It never knows whether it's using something for a particular purpose that is more or less valuable than other purposes that it could be used for. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment. And so without the calculation of profit and loss, as we have under capitalism, socialist planners cannot know the most valuable use of resources. And therefore, Mises meant this literally, a socialist economy in which you economize resources, you only use them for your most highly valued uses. A socialist economy is impossible, okay? He wasn't exaggerating. When I looked at his argument, I mean, even many Austrians would say, well, Mises is exaggerating. In fact, Murray Rothbard when he wrote me a letter on an article I wrote about this, he said, well, even myself, deep down in my own heart, he says, I thought Mises was a little bit, was exaggerating slightly. He says, but now I see that, that you have shown that it was really impossible. Because it destroys the division of labor. There is no more division of labor. You can't determine where people and things that are productive best fit, okay? So, the key to socialism is not a lack of incentives, the fact that you can't get people to do what you want because you're not giving them the incentives to do those things. It's not a lack of knowledge, that you don't know how to produce things technically, or you don't know what people may like, okay, in general, okay? It's the fact that there's a single will acting. So I want to read this. Mises says, the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It is immaterial whose will it is. It could be just one dictator, could be a central planning board, it could be everybody voting democratically about how to use things. Doesn't matter. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system. Now, why is that so important? Because when you have one will, you don't have different people with different values interacting on markets to form prices, okay? One will cannot generate a price structure, a price system, which is very, very complicated, okay? One price alone means nothing. You have to have a sort of an interconnected structure of prices to be meaningful, okay? And those prices have to be able to change relative to one another to show what goods should be produced, what goods should be produced with a different technology, and what goods shouldn't be produced at all right? And I'll talk about this. So, Mises pointed out that there are three preconditions of economic calculation. Private property in all stages of goods. People have to be able to own everything, all kinds of goods, all kinds of capital goods, factories, as well as natural resources, coal mines, diamond mines, sources of oil, fisheries, and so on. So you have to have private ownership, not only private ownership, but the second point, you need exchange. People have to be permitted to exchange these things with one another so that a market comes into existence and generates prices that can be used for economic calculation. Right? And finally, there has to be a sound money. That is, there has to be a money whose value is not controlled by politicians. Now, socialism abolishes all three of these things, okay? And therefore, it makes economic calculation impossible, and therefore, it makes a rational allocation of resources, rational use of resources, impossible. Okay. So let me give you an idea of the calculation problem, a very simple example here. Mises said, look, the planners, they have scientists and engineers that can inform them of all the different ways of producing a given good, or all the ways of producing different goods. That is, they can know their production function. In economics, a production function is a recipe for how to produce a particular good, okay? And to produce any one good, there are many different recipes, okay, as we'll see. But let's take this recipe for a Detroit muscle car, a Chevy SS, which is no longer produced, unfortunately. And let's say you need so much steel, you need so much machine time, unskilled labor, engineering labor, factory space, kilowatt hours of electricity, gallons of paint. Notice that all of the units are heterogeneous. You can't add up tons of steel with gallons of paint, with kilowatts of hours, okay? You can't know, just from the technical data, which the planners would have, you cannot know the cost of producing this particular automobile. Okay, now how is this problem solved under capitalism? It's solved through economic calculation. All of those resources that go into the production of that automobile have prices because they're all exchanged at every moment on the market. So there's always an existing price structure. So if you can conceive of producing any good, you can always know its cost of production. As long as you know the production function, you know how much of each input is necessary, you can calculate, you can find out the price of those inputs and calculate the costs. Okay. And because the price structure is ongoing, and because entrepreneurs are always aiming their production towards the future, entrepreneurs will then anticipate what the output price will be, the price of that automobile. And the comparison of the cost of production with the price of the product itself will allow the entrepreneur to know whether this will result in profits or losses. So in this case, let's assume that the car has a cost of production, which can be easily calculated, of $50,000. And the firm forecasts that consumers will be willing to buy the output that they're going to produce at $55,000 per car, okay? Over and above all costs, including the opportunity costs of the capital they've invested and so on. So that's a $5,000 pure profit. And therefore, that indicates, one, that they themselves will benefit, but it also indicates to the economist, okay, that society is benefiting, that resources that would have been used to produce household appliances and bicycles and other things worth $50,000, because that $50,000 is what the entrepreneurs will bid for those resources, right? And so if you can get them for $50,000 by bidding against these entrepreneurs, and you can use them to produce something that's valued by consumers at $55,000, you are using resources that are undervalued and putting them into a higher valued use, okay? On the other hand, if the entrepreneurs anticipate that the consumers will only pay $48,000 for this automobile, then they would be wasting resources and they would be losing some of their capital by investing. So the incentive is tied up with the calculation, okay? The incentive doesn't exist alone, okay? The calculation is the key, right? So they will not produce that good. Not only that, take the simple bumpers. I mean, we used to have steel bumpers, and that looked like the right thing to do, right? To have steel bumpers on automobiles because they're stronger and they withstand impact better. But now we have fiberglass bumpers. Why do we have fiberglass bumpers? Because even though fiberglass bumpers are less, stand up less well under impact and crack and so on, the calculation is such that it's worth paying less for the fiberglass bumper and taking a slightly lower price for the car than it is for paying for a steel bumper. That is, people would rather undergo the repair costs than pay the extra amount for the steel bumper. So it's not just that. I mean, every single aspect of any good that's produced is subject to calculation. Airlines compete on literal inches between the seat and the seats, okay? So an airline will calculate that an extra inch of room will allow me to charge $10 more for each seat in the airplane, okay? But on the other hand, it will remove 2 rows of seats and cause me to have fewer consumers, paying prices for a particular flight. So bottom line is that even inches of airline, of seat space for people is subject to calculation, okay? Everything is. Now, are entrepreneurs always right? No. I mean, GM lost tremendous amounts of money back in the 1980s when Japanese cars were introduced and they didn't downsize their cars. They lost billions of dollars, as an example, okay? And had the Reagan administration not bailed out the automobile industry by limiting, through voluntary export restraints, the amount of Japanese cars that were permitted to be exported to the U.S., Chrysler would have gone out of business, and GM would have been a lot smaller and much more efficient, okay? So they make mistakes, but the point is they're able to calculate. And they are able to realize that the mistakes that they make and then revise their anticipations of the future, okay? Whereas the socialist planner doesn't have the slightest idea of whether he or she is even making a mistake. So let me go to an example of a mistake that no doubt was made in the Soviet Union. I have a friend that I grew up with who actually married a real cowboy out in Montana. She's from New Jersey, and so she moved out to Montana and lived on a ranch. And the ranch actually had some working oil wells. They discovered oil on the ranch and so on. And so they're doing very well. And so one day she called me up and she said, we're getting a new house. I said, oh, you're moving out of Montana? She says, no. She says, we're having the house shipped in. I said, really? She said, yeah. So what occurs out there, because there's like 12 people in Montana, right? So the labor force is tiny. So labor is very, very scarce, there's 1 million cows and so on, cattle. But labor is very scarce, very high. So, and transportation costs, since Montana's a big state, to get a construction crew to come to your property and build you a new house, very, very expensive. It's actually cheaper, and this is what she did, to have the house built in Nebraska. So she had the house built in a factory in Nebraska, in modular pieces, and then shipped on those huge wide load trucks, shipped 687 miles to Biddle, Montana, where she lives. And it was a big 5 or 6 bedroom home, huge home that was not actually her home. It was something like her home, but it wasn't her home. That's a modular, that was built in pieces, that was put together, okay? So it's cheaper than to have it built with much more capital. That is, in a big factory, that's where they're built, in these huge factories with a lot of machinery and few laborers, and then to pay for transportation. It's cheaper to do that than to actually have someone come to your property and you know, a construction crew, and build it in the way that we would build it, for example, in the Northeast or even in the Southeast, okay, where labor is much less scarce. Now, how did people figure that out? How did the entrepreneurs in Nebraska know that people in Montana would buy houses in Nebraska and have them shipped? Through prices, okay? Through calculation. Could that ever conceivably happen where there are no prices? Of course not. It just sounds so counterintuitive to have a house shipped 700 miles, okay? So socialism is economic chaos and irrationality, because there is no compass. As Mises once pointed out, that trying to decide how to, in an economy like we have today, in the United States, let's say, where we have a multitude of different goods that we could produce, and almost an infinite number of ways of producing these goods, literally almost an infinite number of ways of producing goods, and we have all of these different kinds of capital goods in different locations. Mises pointed out that it's like a man in the middle of a desert with no compass, okay? Yes, he can purposely go in a certain way and purposely think that he's going to achieve his goal of getting out of the desert sooner rather than later, okay? But he has no knowledge of how to do it. If he had a compass, then he would have something to give him direction, okay? And that's what the price system is in some sense. Okay, I'm going to jump over this. So now let's talk about the former Soviet Union, some of the problems that it ran into. Production in the Soviet Union was done through gross output planning. That is, that each industry was given a target of, for example, how many nails it had to produce, how many chandeliers it had to produce, how many yards of women's clothing it had to produce. And these weren't given in value terms, they were given in physical terms. How many tons of nails had to be produced, how many yards of women's clothing had to be produced, how many chandeliers of a certain size had to be produced. Well, when you have that kind of planning, and Ghost Plan is the name of the agency, the Central Planning Agency in the Soviet Union, okay? It's very difficult to specify the qualities and varieties of the product. And so we had situations where women in the Soviet Union were constantly, petite women were constantly complaining because all the clothes were huge, because that was the easiest way to fill the target of X yards of cloth made into women's dresses. Also, children's clothing was in scarce supply, okay? You had a lot of, big people's clothing and adults' clothing being produced. In the case of agriculture, there was a famine in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, and yet observers saw that there were just fields of wheat that were not harvested, and there were tractors in those fields of wheat that were just sitting there rusting, because there were too many tractors produced and too much wheat planted, but there was not enough gasoline produced and not enough laborers on the farms to produce those, to use the tractors. They were all producing the steel and the tractors that were then rusting in the fields, okay? So it was chaotic. There was also, a shortage of housing, but there were a lot of buildings that were standing empty with no roofs on them. And the reason was because the firms producing nails would only produce very, very large nails, because nails were specified in, the target for the amount of nails you had to produce was specified in terms of tons. So small roofing nails were not produced in sufficient number, okay? And so it's a case of mutual lying. The managers of the firms will tell their industry ministers, well, we can only produce X tons of nails or whatever it might be. And so they're lowballing, right? They're saying that they can actually produce fewer, because they know that the managers, or rather the ministers, will tell them whatever they say will increase that by 20%, okay? And the ministers know they're lying, so they'll actually increase it by more, which means that then they'll lie even more and reduce it. So information, to the extent that it did exist, flowing between different firms and managers and so on, was all based on lies. And here's an interesting cartoon, which I looked for a long time. That's the Soviet nail, the famous Soviet nail cartoon. And so that's the manager of the firm telling the minister of the industry, well, comrade, I've met my quota, okay? And also another famous story was that of Khrushchev, the Soviet dictator, in 1956 in the UN. He made a very fiery speech in which he took off his shoe and he banged it on the table, and he said to the West, he said, "We will bury you." And he was talking about economics. He meant that we're going to outproduce you, we're going to bury you. And so the Soviet economists, when they were talking to their Western colleagues, said, yes, we're going to bury you economically, but, and the whole world will be socialist, but not Hong Kong. We're going to leave Hong Kong so we can see the prices. Because as I'll show you in a moment, how did the Soviet Union actually last for 75 years? Was Mises wrong? Was it really possible? In fact, no. Mises pointed out that a state like the Soviet Union could exist. One more, before I get to that, one more example. Khrushchev also once gave a speech to the Politburo, sort of the chiefs of the Soviet Union, and in which he began to berate the chandelier industry, because their chandeliers were so heavy, because they were stated in terms of pounds of chandeliers you have to produce, that they were coming down from the dashas. They were pulling the roofs down on the comrades in the Communist Party and killing them. Okay, people actually were dying from these chandeliers crashing down on dinners and so on. So all of these examples went around back in the 1980s. Okay. So I just want to talk just a minute or two. Well, actually, before I do that, I do want to mention the topic that I was about to talk about before, which oh yeah, was why did the Soviet Union last for 75 years? Mises pointed out in his original article that a single socialist state in a capitalist world was no different than the post office, okay? The post office did not really calculate, okay? But they were able to, they weren't profit making, let's put it that way. They didn't calculate to make profits, okay, the US Post Office. But they were able to use the prices of the surrounding, of the inputs that they were using, because they were an island in the middle of capitalist prices, in the middle of markets. So we had a rough idea of how inefficient or how efficient they were. There was a rough idea, okay? How much the taxpayer would have to bail them out by. So we sort of knew that. And that was Mises' point, that the same thing was true of a single socialist state in a capitalist world, or several socialist states. They could always use prices. And in fact, the Soviet Union did use capitalist prices. In fact, it engaged in trade. It sold coal, electricity, diamonds, gold on capitalist markets. So it had an idea about prices. It also could copy prices that it saw in the world economy. There's a story that Red China had in the 50s, ordered a lot of Sears catalogs to get an idea about how to price things. Also in the Soviet Union, there was a system of bribes, in which firms that maybe had too much wood or not enough nails may be willing to bribe other firms to supply the wood by selling them nails. And you sort of got a system of trade going on there, and there were sort of rough prices. And also there's a black market. There's a black market in which money was paid for goods and services in the Soviet Union. Now, none of these prices were really the correct prices. So the Soviet Union was still enormously inefficient, okay? And eventually did collapse. Okay? So because the prices they were using from other places did not reflect the scarcity conditions in the Soviet Union. There was a period in which there was actual full communism in the Soviet Union, in which prices were completely abolished. And that was a period of war communism from 1917 to 1921. During that period, the planners were not permitted to use prices, and so prices were abolished. But what happened was that production the whole productive system more or less fell apart. And people, I mean, they didn't even have enough fuel during the winter to keep people warm. So people were breaking up their furniture and actually setting it on fire to keep warm, and actually then taking parts of their home apart, okay, their apartments and so on, and burning them. And eventually people had to move out of the cities, okay? They were flowing out of the cities into the countryside to forage for food. So socialism kind of threw man back to primitive times. I mean, so socialism can work among small groups, small household economies, right? But it can't work in an industrial economy. And so the whole thing fell apart. The same thing was true with Pol Pot, the Cambodian dictator in the 1980s, in which he emptied out the cities, and they sort of went just back to the land, and millions of people died, either were murdered or died from starvation. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the social appraisement process. That's a fancy word, or phrase. Mises used it, and all he meant was the process by which the price structure emerges spontaneously from a market economy. So if you look in the middle of that diagram, you'll see entrepreneurs, okay? The entrepreneurs are the central player in this appraisement process. Now, what does it mean to be an appraisement process? Simply that there are prices put on the various resources. Where do those prices come from? Well, the entrepreneurs look forward. Okay, so they look up towards the future price of consumer goods at the top of the diagram. They estimate, forecast what these prices will be, and then they know how much they can bid for the factors of production, for the land, labor, and capital goods that they need, okay? And all of that bidding, okay, in the midst of bidding for these things, prices, it's like a big auction, okay? Prices emerge, and then they can calculate the cost of production and compare that to the forecast prices of the goods. It's not enough just to have the forecast prices of the goods. You have to have someone bidding for the resources and bidding intelligently based on prices that they expect. And the prices of consumer goods that they expect are based on prices of consumer goods in the past, okay? Even someone like Steve Jobs that came up with the iPhone, he had some idea. He knew there was no iPhone before, but there were other things like it. There were telephones. There were different ways of communicating. So he estimated what consumers would pay to have a mobile phone, a phone which allowed them to speak and then have a smartphone and so on. He had an idea. There were computers. There were phones. And so he came up with these estimated prices. And then he as one entrepreneur, bid for the factors that he needed. And he estimated that the cost of production would be less than the iPhone. He was right, and he made profits. Okay, again, a planner could never really do that. Okay, all right. Let me just quickly go to the reactions to this. Okay, so initially, when Mises first set forth his argument in this article in 1920. You had some naive Marxist responses. So first they said, well, you know, what's the big deal about calculating? Okay, we'll just calculate in kind. And what they meant by that, it was one particular Marxist, Otto Neurath, who was sort of an enemy of Mises. He said, well, we can just calculate costs by adding up goods in their natural units. We'll add tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity, gallons of paint. I mean, the proper response to that is, that's ridiculous. You can't add apples and oranges, okay? The second response, and by the way, Mises really addressed all of these naive responses in his original article, is that we can calculate with labor hours. Labor hours are homogeneous. And so that we can just add up the labor hours for producing different goods, and we can see what the costs of production are. Well, labor hours are not homogeneous, genius, okay? In fact, we know that, you know, the The quality of a labor hour of someone who's a cashier at McDonald's differs from that of someone who's a software engineer or a brain surgeon, or even take the same profession. Okay, the quality of labor that put forth by, let's say, LeBron James is much higher quality, much more valuable than the quality of the 12th man sitting at the end of the bench on an NBA team. Okay, and also, of course, it leaves out the fact that capital and natural resources are also scarce and also have to be economized. And that you can't compare even the same labor, same quality labor, if one is working with more capital and more resources. You have to know where the resources, where the natural resources and the capital goods should be allocated. And finally, the socialists came up with another solution, and that was, let's just tell the managers on the first day of socialism, which starts tomorrow, just come in and do the same thing that you've been doing, for the past few years. Okay, just do the same thing. Okay, if they can do it under capitalism, we can do it under socialism. And of course, what's the problem with that? That assumes that there's no change in the world, that technology never changes, never improves, that you never run out of resources, natural resources, and then find new sources of resources. New sources of natural resources, or actually discover totally different kinds of natural resources, and that consumer value scales, our values and choices, will ever change, okay? So, in a dynamic world, maybe the first few months socialism would operate efficiently, but over time, as all these, as capital goods wear out, they should be replaced with better and different capital goods. In fact, you're just doing the same thing, and it's becoming less and less reflective of what should be produced in the economy, and therefore much more chaotic and wasteful. Okay. And last, I'll just give, because I'm running out of time here, there were much more sophisticated responses that came forth in the 1930s, which were produced by neoclassically trained economists, mainly British and American economists, okay? And Hayek and Lionel Robbins responded to them and basically said, well, yes, theoretically, these solutions could work, but they wouldn't really be practical. But Mises responded in a much more incisive way. Mises said, look, all of these solutions, having socialist managers pretend that they're earning profits, assumes that the market economy is a managerial economy, and that the firms will just continue to exist and try to earn profits, whereas, in fact, we want creative destruction, in Schumpeter's terms, okay? The actual economy is an entrepreneurial economy in which new firms are created, old firms must be destroyed, labor is moved into new occupations and professions, so it misses the whole point of a dynamic economy. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, as the aging knight says in the Indiana Jones movie, The Holy Grail, after Indiana Jones drinks from the true grail, you have chosen wisely. And what we're going to talk about in this time is the very last element of economic theory of the working of the market economy. So we've built this up over the last day and a half. We've seen all the essential, at least, features of theorizing about the market economy, understanding it. And we're left just with this final point about the rate of interest. So that's what we want to focus on. And we'll do this in 3 steps as we've done previously. We want to talk about fundamentals first, just to see how we build the theory of the interest rate out of these fundamentals. And then we'll talk about the 2 ways in which people value action with respect to time. And then once we're finished with that, we'll talk about the rate of interest, the theory of the interest rate. So let's begin with the principle that just like as we talked about on Monday, when we think about human nature and human action, what it means to be a human person engaged in action, we can immediately recognize that we're finite beings. And because we're finite beings, we make this distinction between ends and means. And then from that, we see that that we have unmet ends, there must be a scarcity of means. And so we proceed right in that way. We've grounded the principle of the scarcity of things in the nature of the world. And so what we're going to do now is talk about the temporal nature of human existence. We're also time-bound beings. We exist in time, right? So we're neither infinite nor eternal. We're finite and temporal. And because of that, we make 2 important distinctions. We distinguish between different moments in time, like right at this moment, at lunchtime, Tuesday versus Wednesday, and so on and so forth. We notice the distinction between those things, right? We recognize that they're different things. And we also then make the distinction between sooner and later. And it's from these 2 distinctions that the 2 valuations of action with respect to time stem. So first, let's talk about this principle of the duration of action. And Dr. Ritenour has talked a little bit about this already, so we've got some background to think about. As Mises puts it in Human Action, when we think about time from the perspective of our action, we divide it into these 3 categories. There's the time before action, and the time during the action, and then the time after the action. Or we could say it this way: for every action, it's a choice variable for us to determine when to start the action and when to stop it. The duration of the action is a choice variable for us. And so we can compress it, we can expand it, we can start it at one moment in time or a different moment in time, and so on and so forth, right? Then the question is, well, how do we make choices with respect to these options available to us? And the answer is the same answer we've always given, right? We do it according to the valuations we make. We might value different moments in time differently. We might value sooner as opposed to later differently, and therefore, lengthen or shorten this duration of action. And then as Mises points out, the other important basic point here is that within the duration of action, within that notion, there are 2 parts. There's a production part and a consumption part. And the production part, Mises calls the period of production. And so the period of production includes what Mises called the working time, or as Dr. Ritenour explained earlier this morning, the production structure, You have to start by extracting raw materials and then produce the intermediate capital goods and then produce the consumer good. And then it may be that once we produce the consumer good, there's maturing time. The flourless chocolate cake has to sit overnight in order to gel into its best form, or wine has to sit in a vat and mature before it's consumed, something like that. And then there's the duration of serviceableness of the consumer good that's been produced. Right? So we can produce an automobile and it has a 10-year durability, and so we can extend the usefulness of the thing over time by the duration of serviceableness. Dr. Ritenour mentioned the different spatulas, right? Of course, those were producer goods, but the idea of durability, that's a choice variable for us. This is the point. So every action looks like this. It's a sequence of steps. Once we start the action, there's a sequence of intermediate action, steps to the action, and then it ends at some point. And these choice variables exist for us then with respect to the overall duration, the period of production within that, the duration of serviceableness of the good that we produce. And then I'll just mention, just in passing, because we're not going to make any use of this notion, but just for completeness, this last point, Mises also points out that because we're temporal beings and we are foreseeing how action will turn out in the future when we act, we also have this notion of the period of provision. So we're always thinking about, with respect to any particular action, we're thinking about the provision in the future, the realization of the ends in the future over some span of time. And this, of course, this period of provision can actually extend beyond our lifetimes. So those of you who already have children, understand this, right? You're doing things now with the anticipation that this will improve their lives once you've gone on to your reward, shall we say. Right, we could have, this is part of human life. We recognize this right away as being a fact of the way that we are as human beings. Okay, so that's the basic point. And now let's turn to this this other issue of the valuation. We're going to turn and then examine this question of the two ways in which we value with respect to time. This gets a little bit tricky. This is a kind of, be very careful in the way you think this out, because there are pitfalls involved in this, just like, again, with Dr. Ritenour's discussion of the capital structure, as he pointed out. But in any case, we want to separate out two different aspects of what we just talked about with respect to action. One is just looking internally at the duration of the action. How do we choose internally the period of production, the duration of serviceableness, for any action that we take? And then the other is, every time we engage in an action, we place that action in the stream of time, so to speak. We choose to start at a particular moment in time and end at another moment in time. So those are two different parameters of choice, right? Two different alternatives of choosing. And this is how Mises puts it. Again, we're going to talk about this in more detail in our next step, but I just want to introduce these 2 points. So Mises puts it this way. He says, there's the time, we all recognize there's the time before satisfaction from an action. This is the period of production, right? We're not getting consumptive satisfaction during the period of production. We start the period of production and we have to go through the whole process, right? And finish it, and then we get the satisfaction. And then there's the time during the satisfaction. This is the duration of serviceableness, right? We can produce a good that's perishable. We can produce a good that's somewhat durable, more durable. We can choose an array of different things that we want in terms of perishable and durable. This is what we're doing. And so what Mises points out here is this is where the principle of sooner versus later comes in. Once we start a production process, we extract raw materials out of nature, and we begin the steps to produce the consumer good, we prefer to get to the satisfaction part of the action sooner, right? This is what Mises calls time preference, For a given satisfaction, we prefer that it come to us sooner as opposed to later. This has to be, though, understood in the context of the duration of the action. This is only within the duration of the action. This isn't talking about when we do the action. It's talking about just whenever we do the action, whenever we choose to start the action. Once we start it, then we prefer sooner to later. We want to shrink the period of production, ceteris paribus, if we could get the same satisfaction. Of course, we can't get the same satisfaction with shorter versus longer production processes or periods of production. So we want to discuss that. But that's the issue. And then the second issue, the point about moments in time, about choosing the timing of an action. Mises points out this, and this is another great. When I first read this, it's just it's so pleasing. It's so aesthetically valuable to read human action or great works, right? It has an aesthetic appeal, and sometimes this comes just in the rhetorical flourishes or in the semantic way in which things are put. So Mises says, "Time is an irreversible flux." Maybe that doesn't strike you, but it just sort of strikes me as quite satisfying way of putting it. It's an irreversible flux. If you want to say this in a more, explanatory way, as I've got on the slide, each moment actually has a unique place in the sequence of moments of time. That's what he's saying. Moments are not homogeneous and interchangeable. Not every moment in the sequence of moments in time is the same. In fact, they're all different. They're different precisely because they come after one another. And things change as time moves on, right, through action. Now, because that's the case, it might just be because the moments in time are heterogeneous. They're not homogeneous, right? They're heterogeneous. It might be that certain moments in time, if an action is taken at that moment, it would convey to us greater value than if the action were taken at a different moment. Just because different moments in time will provide different conditions for the subjective value that can be attained from an action. Okay, so again, this is not an explanation, but just I wanted to introduce these notions, and then we'll go to the explanation. Okay, so we're going to do these in reverse order. I'm going to take the second first, because again, this one has nothing to do with interest rates. That's what we want to show now, that the timing of an action, this question, is not the foundation of interest. The foundation of interest is from the intertemporal, choosing to start an action, committing resources to that goal, giving them up, in other words, surrendering them to that goal, and then only obtaining the satisfaction later. Okay, so we'll call this, again, the timing of an action. We choose with respect to the timing of an action, and this is the point I just made, that the value of a good that we use in action can vary depending on the moment that we use it in action. And so because of that, we will always allocate or we'll always consider, in the allocation of an action, we'll always consider this value difference, right? It may not be determinative to us, because other things could be different too, if we take an action at a different moment in time. But this is the basic point. And so just one example of this, my wife and I, our wedding anniversary is November 17th. We were married November 17th, 1983. So just like with Dr. Ritenour, we've gone through several mixers. So, and this is a good thing, a wonderful thing. So in any case, we'll celebrate our anniversary. But I guarantee you that, especially for my wife, it has more value if we do it on November 17th than if we do it on November 1st, or, heaven forbid if I forget and we do it on December 1st. That would really lower the value, right, of the same event. It would change just based upon the moment in time. Okay, so this is what we're speaking about, right? Notice the principle here is we don't have to commit any resources at all now, sooner, as opposed to later in that respect. We're just saying we're just going to commit our resources at the moment that we want to do the action, not now. We're going to, whatever, decide on a fancy place to go to dinner, and I'll get some roses and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm not committing anything now. We're just saying we'll do that in due time. And then once we decide it's going to be November 17th, then we'll have to start the action, right? So I'll have to start the action. I'll have to secure the roses and, the cake and whatever else we do. That's the duration of the action. That's when the action is, that's when we look at the duration principles of the action. Okay. Now let me change my example to go to the market. So here, let's just look at this example, just because it's a well-worn example. Let's say we look at a commodity price. Let's say the price of oil, and we look at the spot price that is the current, purchase trade price, and it's $30 a barrel, or whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but let's just say it's $30 a barrel. Now, people who are involved in using oil as a producer good, and they're buying and selling it, and so on, they're extracting it and then refining it, and they would also be interested not only in that price, the spot price, but in what the price will be at some moment in the future. And if they form let's say they form expectations, financial traders and others involved in this, they form expectations that the fake pandemic is going to end, and the lockdown's going to end, and things are going to go back to normal, and we'll have a pretty normal array of demands for oil-based products and so on. And so in 6 months, the price of oil is going to be $60. At that moment, they're saying, 6 months from today, it's going to be $60. So they start to form these expectations, right? Well, they can make contracts today called forward transactions, not committing any resources today, but just agreeing today to trade at $60 a barrel in 6 months. They have to have different speculations, but if they do, you have reverse preferences and they can make trades. So we can get forward prices. Forward prices then give us the market manifestation of the timing of action. They're nothing more than that, right? There's nothing intertemporal going on here. People are just assessing what they think the future price of a good will be. They're not committing themselves any resources until that day, just like I was suggesting I would do with respect to my anniversary. Now, if it's true that the forward price was $60 and the spot price were $30, then there would be, of course, profit opportunity. There's a higher value for oil in the future, higher price for it, right? And you could earn profit by transferring the oil use from the present to 6 months from today. But again, in order to do the contract for this, you don't need to actually own the oil. In fact, it's sort of incidental as to how you come to own the oil in the future to provide the good. Whether you're an oil producer and you refine it and you're just holding it in storage, or whether you just go into the spot market and buy it, right? That's immaterial. So again, there's no intertemporal dimension here. And then, of course, as the supply of oil is being shifted to the future date, the prices, the spot price and the forward price would come together. This is just the same process that we have in any market that we explained again on Monday. Right? This is the efficient allocation temporally of a good from one moment in time to another moment in time to another moment in time. Okay, so that, having set that aside, let's get to the main point. And by the way, I'm my caveat is, there are a lot of nuances and difficult, things we have to think out more carefully than I'm suggesting here. I'm just sort of giving you introductory discussion of these issues. And then we'll save the difficult stuff for Q&A. Okay, so let's go to time preference and the intertemporal dimensions. So this is how time preference is typically defined. Or I think maybe I should say best defined. That a given satisfaction is preferred sooner to later. So this is what we had mentioned before from Mises. Now, here we want to stress another point, because again, oftentimes people conflate two different notions of preference in general even, as well as time preference. What we're using these terms to refer to is something, as we've said, embedded in the nature of the case. It simply can't be otherwise. In other words, you cannot come up with a counterexample showing that a person acted contrary to his or her preferences. There is no such thing. This is just what we mean by the word preference, that a person's choice and action is always consistent with their preference. That's what we mean by it, right? And so it doesn't do any good to try to come up with counterexamples. So we're saying the same thing about time preference. This is also true of time preference if we're right about the logic of this. It's embedded in human nature, and therefore there are no counterexamples. Every counterexample just is misunderstanding what time preference is, or it's it's confusing timing and time preference. It's confusing these two distinctions we made before: the duration of the action and the moment in time when it's taken, or something else like that, right? It's okay to any examples, but you've read in the literature some of these examples. Okay, and then I have one quote, just again to sort of have this in Mises's words. This quote from Human Action, page 480 in the Scholar's edition. So he says, and this is all in, these are different paragraphs, but it's the same text. It's running down to a new paragraph. So there's no separation in the text between these two quotes. Other things being equal, satisfaction in a nearer period in the future is preferred to satisfaction in a more distant period. Disutility is seen in waiting. So that's how he defines time preference. Right? Satisfaction in a sooner period is preferred to satisfaction in a later period. And then he adds this aside, disutility. There's disutility seen in waiting. And then he goes on and says, this fact is already implied in the statement stressed in the opening of this chapter that man distinguishes between the time before a satisfaction is attained and the time for the duration of which there is satisfaction. This is the point that I made in the previous slide, right? A person, in every action, we always distinguish between the period of production and the duration of serviceableness of the good that we produced, right? That's just in the nature of the case. And once we distinguish between these two, then we just see right away that we must prefer to shrink the period of production and extend the duration of serviceableness. It's just in the nature of the case, right? It's just what it means to be human, to have this preference. Okay, so that's Mises on these points. And now we want to talk just about the implications. So time preference is just an implication. It's a logical implication of, interest. The pure rate of interest is just a logical implication of time preference. But there's another implication that I want to mention just so you can connect things that have already been discussed. So this is back to Dr. Ritenour's talk this morning. Time preference determines, or maybe we should say the rate of time preference, how intense people's time preferences are, determine the intertemporal production choices. So this is the basic claim, right? These are, as I put it on the slide, regulated by time preference. So whether we choose to engage in shorter production processes or longer, and so on, that is all regulated by our time preferences. And with lower time preferences, we'll engage in longer, more productive production processes. And with shorter time preferences, people would engage in shorter, less productive production processes. So this is the idea. Notice other implications come from this pretty quickly, like this one. At any given moment in time, if you just have kind of a snapshot view of the economy, it must be the case that entrepreneurs have already engaged in the shortest, most productive production processes that they have available, that they've created or see as possible. They won't engage in, of course, they won't engage in shorter, less productive production processes because of time preference. And in order to engage in longer production processes, they would have to be more productive than the shorter processes. So you see there's a certain logic of the whole configuration of the capital structure. Dr. Newman will talk about this in the lecture on the business cycle theory. This is kind of it's not the most important point, but it's a key element of understanding the cycle, where the capital structure gets artificially lengthened out. Well, why does it have to do that? Well, this is one reason why it has to do that. Okay, so then let's go to the pure rate of interest. And here we've given a definition. So the pure rate of interest, we're isolating just the time preference premium of present money over future money. So this is not a full analysis of the market rate of interest, which has other sources to it besides the time preference sort. There are other causes of, at least potentially in principle, there are other causes of market rates of interest besides the time preference, besides the pure rates. So in order to have this clear, keep this clear, we'll call this time preference interest rate, we'll call this the pure rate of interest. This is Rothbard's terminology. You'll also notice that this pure rate of interest is always expressed in money, in the exchange of present money for future money. It's never expressed in terms of goods. In other words, nobody engages in intertemporal trade in goods. This, by the way, is a rather important side point to this whole discussion, because as we mentioned, I think yesterday, the neoclassical general equilibrium model of the economy doesn't include money. There is no medium of exchange in it. They're just barter goods. And if they're just barter goods, how is the interest rate expressed? And the answer is it's expressed in goods. It has to be, because that's all there is in the model. There's no medium of exchange. But if it's expressed in goods, you get a big problem, which is if you actually had intertemporal exchange of different goods, the interest rate, the relation between the future price and the present price would be radically different across the different goods. Why is that? Well, that would happen because different goods have different future prices because of the moment in time when they're taken, right? They would have different forward prices. And by the way, those of you who know about finance, you know that these, as I mentioned this point already, I guess, the forward prices will come into relationship with spot prices through this arbitrage, but they won't be exactly equal. There'll be a difference. And the difference is the interest rate, well, and other ancillary things like storage costs and so on, right? You see, you can't explain the interest rate that way. The interest rate is what explains the difference between the forward price and the spot price. This is all, there's a lot of confusion in this area, a lot of difficulty, right? That we have to think out carefully. So money is used because money is it provides us with the unit of economic calculation for all people, in all places, and in all moments of time. It's a uniform, homogeneous unit of economic calculation, the dollar. This doesn't mean, again, that the dollar would have the same purchasing power necessarily in the present and the future, but we can account for that, right? What money doesn't have is all the vagaries of shifting consumption demand and demand for producer goods that exist for all the other goods in the economy. Money has demand only as a medium of exchange. And so whatever vagaries it has can be anticipated and adjusted for. And so we get a single uniform pure rate of interest when money is used as opposed to exchanging in goods. And this allows us then to have efficient intertemporal allocation of goods. So that's the way the argument runs out. Okay, now let's go through the nuts and bolts. The nuts and bolts, again, are just going back to the discussion we had on Monday morning, where, and I've reproduced this, right, real briefly, the first 3 steps of price theory that we talked about on Monday are that people have preferences for consumer goods. These preferences sometimes are reversed, and when they're reversed, then trade can take place, mutually advantageous trade can take place. And then the market clearing price is forthcoming to facilitate these trades. And so there's nothing behind the price of consumer goods in this theory except people's preferences. Now, I might add here just a note, just so again we're not thinking wrongly about this claim. It's perhaps better to put the claim this way. Anything that can affect the price of a good only does so by changing people's preferences or influencing their preferences. Then their demands and supplies will change, and then the price will change. But if this causal factor that exists outside of a person, situation or other people doing things that they weren't doing before or whatever, is to affect the price, it has to change the person's preferences who are in this market demanding and supplying the good. That's the argument, right? It's not that preferences are the end all of everything. It's that we have no scientific theory to explain how these outside factors change preferences. There is no theory like that. And so scientific economics must begin with preferences as a given. We're not saying that that's true in real life, right? We're saying that's our theoretical framework, and we can then apply that to real life, where all these situations are changing, and then people's preferences change, and prices change, and so on. So we're going to argue then the same thing about time preferences. People have time preferences. We can have some who are more intensely prefer the present satisfaction, those who less intensely prefer present satisfaction. They can engage in mutually advantageous trade of present money for future money, and the pure rate of interest emerges. Let me then run through just a quick numeric example like we did with Caruso's preference ranks before. Let's suppose we have person A with the preference rank as I've depicted. So you'll notice, of course, that time preference dictates that, oh wow, this isn't, does that show up? I can't see that. Oh, that's weird. Okay, it shows up good on the wall. Okay, that's strange. Okay, so anyway, you'll see on both sets of preference ranks that $1,000 today is ranked above $1,000 a year from today. It's at the bottom of each preference rank. That's because of time preference, right? Present satisfaction is preferred to a future satisfaction. We're assuming the purchasing power of these funds are the same. But there might be some amount of future money that would be preferred to this principal amount of present money. And for person A, it's $100. A $100 premium would be sufficient to get person A to part with $1,000 today in order to get $1,100 in a year. So that's the intensity of person A's time preference. And you can see then that person B has a more intense time preference, right? A higher rate of time preference. In order to get person B to sacrifice $1,000 today, the premium would have to be $300. Person B's time preference interest rate is 30% and person A's is 10%. In my example, right? So obviously they can make a mutually advantageous trade at any interest rate, any pure interest rate between 10% and actually 29%, right? Because person B won't pay $300, but he would pay $290 to get a maximum amount, right? To get 1,000 today. Okay, so that's the idea. They would just get together, and I mean, they could conceptually they get together and find out about these preferences. They could trade. They could person A could be the lender of present money, and person B could be the borrower of present money. Then the only other thing we have to do, of course, is introduce a competitive bidding and offering, just like we did again on Monday for goods in general. We, of course, in a market economy, we'll have more than one potential lender with lower time preference and more than one potential borrower with higher time preference. And the interest rate produces the maximum amount of social cooperation between them. When the market clearing rate is achieved, then it's achieved precisely because that will allow all of the lenders to find a borrower and all of the borrowers to find a lender. And it creates the maximum amount of social cooperation in the market. And so again, there's nothing different here than we argued on Monday. It's just a general explanation of preference and demand supply explanation of the rate of interest. Now let's deal with, well, let me just summarize and then we'll deal with one other issue. So up to this point then we've noted that time preference determines it has two important effects or determines two important things in the economy. It determines first the pure rate of interest, and it determines the amount of present money lent and borrowed. And by the way, this is not unusual, it's not something weird to the interest rate, right? This is true for all market prices. So the demand and supply, in other words, and preferences that stand behind them, determine the price of every good and the quantity of the good traded. It simultaneously determines both those things. So it determines, as Dr. Ritenour was pointing out, it determines the extent to which there's saving that can then be invested. And then I want to just emphasize this point that I made before about money performing the unit of economic calculation function across time. And so I've just reproduced a simple example of compounding and discounting with the present sum. And so what the interest rate is doing is making the alternative to someone who participates in lending and borrowing, making the two alternatives of monetary sums exactly the same. You can either have $1,000 in your hand today, or at a 25% interest rate, you can have $1,250 a year from today. Those are exactly, they're made equivalent, right? And then of course, if there's different purchasing power of the money in the future, that can be adjusted for. So this is just another piece of evidence that it's money that's used here always in intertemporal exchange. So if someone is to acquire through production the sale of a good, $1,250 in a year, that entrepreneur will be willing to pay $1,000 today for the factors of production. So those two sums are made equivalent by the interest rate, right? This is how the interest rate is regulating the intertemporal activity of production. Okay, now let's, this is the last step we'll take really. We'll go in and talk about the different components of the time market, the different options for lending present money and borrowing present money. And this is just straight from Rothbard. So Rothbard very helpfully divides this into credit markets and the capital structure. So credit markets are when people engage in lending and borrowing, supplying present money and demanding present money, where the contract between them is not fulfilled until the future. So you know, you take out a mortgage, and then you as the homeowner, you get the funds, right? And you pay the builder, but that's just the first step of the contract. The agreement, the lending and borrowing agreement, isn't finished until you make your last payment. So that's called a credit transaction. Anytime the fulfillment of the contract is only done in the future. And so there are lots of different kinds of credit transactions, right? And then within the credit markets, there can be borrowed money that's used to buy consumer goods. So we say the consumer loan markets. And then we could subdivide those, right, in, I mentioned already, the mortgage market or the auto loan market or the general merchandise market and so on and so forth. And then there's the producer loan market, where entrepreneurs go into credit markets and they borrow contractually, right, and then pay back the money over time. So bond markets and commercial paper markets and so on and so forth, these producer loan markets. And then there's the capital structure. So once again, this Dr. Ritenour was explaining this morning. Here, entrepreneurs borrow from the capitalists, or they provide their own capital funding. They save and provide their own capital funding. And then buy inputs. That's a cash transaction, right, for them. It's not a credit transaction. They just buy it and get the service. And then they own the command over the services. They produce a good, and then they sell it to a different group of people at some future moment in time, right, at the end of the production process. Another cash transaction. They sell. I'm not saying they can't sell on credit or anything. I'm saying there's no credit transaction between the lending of the money by the entrepreneur and the receiving back of the money from the consumer. there's no contract there, right? Okay, so there's just this structure, there's just this production process within the capital structure. And as Dr. Ritenour already explained this morning, the size of the time market, the amount of saving and investing in the economy that goes into the capital structure dwarfs the size of the consumer loans. Hopefully you see already that all the producer loan funding goes into the capital structure. That's the reason the entrepreneur is borrowing the money, right? He's going to buy inputs. And so that's really just part of the capital structure in that sense, right? One last point on this, I'll just note that the typical neoclassical treatment of the loanable funds market tends to focus just on producer loans, right? So you'll see this kind of treatment, especially say in Keynesian, liquidity preference model of the interest rate. That again is not very robust, right? Sure, they're producer loans and we need to analyze that, but we can't really analyze that unless we embed it properly in the broader market in which it's a part of. Otherwise, we're thinking about it wrongly, right? We're thinking about it isolated, and we're ignoring these interconnections that exist. So that's the next thing that I want to mention, and this is just a simple example of this interconnection. Suppose we have consumer loans, suppose the loans demand and supply look like this, and we'll start at point A, and we have a very low pure interest rate at R sub 0. But in the capital structure, and entrepreneurs are earning an interest rate much higher. They're earning R0 at point A on the right-hand panel. Well, this can't persist, right? Not if these are just pure rates of interest. If there's no difference between these loans that the capitalists might make into consumer or production loans, then this interest rate difference will be arbitraged away. Right? The supply by the capitalists of the loanable funds will be shifted out of consumer loans where the interest rate is low and into loans in the capital structure where the interest rate is higher. But as this happens, the interest rates come together. And so the interest rate in producer loans depends upon the interest rate in consumer loans, depends upon interest rates that permeate the capital structure. They're jointly determined, so to speak, right? They're determined by this uniform process. They can't get very far out of sync with one another before the arbitrage process would earn profit for the entrepreneurs who see this and act upon it. I want to make one last point on this, and then we'll just, I want to make a summary point because I've been ignoring these other factors that affect the interest rate. So here I just cited an example, and I'm not going to run through this, you could just read this from the slide, about how not only will this pure rate of interest be the same across the credit loans and the capital structure activity, it will be the same in every production process in the capital structure as long as we're just looking at the same time dimension for production. Right? And so the point I want to go on to now is this last point, because again, there are a lot of theories about the interest rate, that the interest rate depends upon the productivity of capital. But this is, again, a widespread but fallacious view. So as I put it here, neither the physical productivity nor the value productivity of assets can affect the pure rate of interest. And Dr. Klein talked about this already yesterday, but I just kind of reproduce a simple example of this. Let's suppose that an entrepreneur has a production process with marginal revenue products from the factors. These are capital, land, and labor in order, C, N, and L, in 1 year. And they're 10,000, 5,000, 2,500. So in other words, he's going to produce a good and sell the good for 17,500. So these would be the marginal revenue products that he's going to earn from that. We'll assume the ERE, there's no profit here in my example. And then the question is, how much will he pay today, right now, to get those funds a year from today? And if the interest rate is 25%, the answer is he'll pay $8,000 for the capital That's 10,000 divided by 1.25, right? Discounted by the rate of interest. And so on, 4,000. So you see the prices of the capital goods adjust to the interest rate, not the other way around. It's not that, you know, you can suddenly earn a gigantic interest rate because future prices are higher. If future prices are really higher, what's going to happen is the entrepreneur is going to bid for the inputs today and drive their prices up. The inputs that can capture those higher prices. It's just another arbitrage opportunity or a profit opportunity from different price structures, right? And the interest rate, though, is what determines how close together they come. And this is the main point. Okay, so then I'll finish up. That slide, by the way, just reiterates what Dr. Klein talked about, so I'm not going to go over that. I'll finish with this slide on the sources of market rates of interest. So if we look at any any market rate of interest, it could have, at least in principle, 4 different component parts. That is 4 different causes. One we've talked about at length, the pure rate of interest. The pure rate of interest then would also generate a yield curve, as long as time preferences are more intense for further out into the future satisfactions, as long as even later satisfactions are less preferred than even sooner ones, then you would see an upward sloping yield curve, right? You'd see higher interest rates for longer term loans and shorter interest rates for shorter term loans. Then the second source of the market rate of interest is entrepreneurial uncertainty. So every different production process or every grouping of different types of production processes could in principle have its own uncertainty associated with it. So in order to give incentive for capitalists to lend into those production processes, it might be that they would command a higher rate of interest to provide compensation to assuming that uncertainty. Then there's the price premium. The price premium comes about in the interest rate because of changes in the money relation. And the changes in particular in the money, well, the last 2 come about because of changes in the money relation, but the particular one that we're talking about here are what are usually called Cantillon effects, the disparate effects on various prices from an increase in, so let's say, the stock of money. So if the money supply is increased, then some prices will go up sooner and some later. Some prices will go up to a greater extent and some to a lesser extent. So if we have a production process located in the mix of this, where the prices of the output go up sooner and to a greater extent, the net income that accrues to that production process will be greater. And this again would be embedded in a higher rate of return for that production process. Again, this has to be unanticipated. Right? If everybody anticipates the Cantillon effects, well, then they bid up the asset prices already and you wouldn't see this. And then there are unanticipated changes in the purchasing power of money. And the same thing, right? It has to be unanticipated. In other words, if most people don't anticipate that the purchasing power of money will be lower in the future, but a couple of people do, then they will only be willing to make lending and borrowing agreements at a higher interest rate that incorporates this declining purchasing power of money in the future. There may be, other conditional features that affect interest rates, but these again are considered to be the sort of theoretical ones, right? The theoretical categories. All right, thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.